In the golden light of Oakhaven-by-the-Sea, Amara carefully prepares her cottage to welcome a small group of friends for a day of tea and storytelling. As they gather to create a communal quilt through the art of memory stitching, the group must navigate their own restlessness and tensions to find a shared sense of peace. Listen along to experience a slow, meditative journey towards stillness and connection. The warmth of preparation. Amara shifted the heavy oak armchair 3 inches to the left, her palms pressing against the worn velvet until the seat caught the precise angle of the 3 o'clock sun. The light in Oakhaven-by-the-Sea didn't just illuminate, it pooled, thick and golden, across the floorboards like spilled honey. She moved to the second chair, then the third, adjusting the tilt so that whoever sat there would feel the warmth on their shoulder without the glare blinding them to the work in their laps. It was a silent choreography, an adjustment of comfort. If the room felt like a hug before the guests even crossed the threshold, the stitching would follow suit. In the kitchen, the kettle let out a low, steady hiss. Amara reached for the ceramic pot, the one with the hairline fracture along the rim that she refused to discard. She measured out the dried chamomile and lavender, the blossoms smelling of summer rain and old sleep. As she poured the water, she watched the infusion happen in real time, the clear liquid swirling into a pale, translucent gold, a color that mirrored the fading light of the afternoon. She didn't rush the steep. To rush the tea was to invite a sharpness, a bitterness that would cut through the softness she was trying to build. She stood still, her gaze fixed on the drifting petals, allowing the steam to dampen her skin. This was the foundation of the memory stitch. Amara had spent 30 years in a classroom managing the electric, chaotic energy of children, and she had learned that the soul is a drifting thing, prone to wandering into anxieties of the future or regrets of the past. The memory stitch was her answer to that drift. It wasn't merely the act of joining fabric, it was the rhythmic, repetitive motion of the needle passing through cloth, over, under, pull, repeat. It was a physical anchor. She believed that if one could synchronize the breath with the stitch, the mind would eventually stop its frantic pacing and settle into the present. The quilt they were building wasn't a product to be finished. It was a vessel for the time they spent in each other's company, a textile record of shared stillness. She moved to the cedar tray on the sideboard, where the cream-colored linen scraps lay in a disordered heap. Amara didn't just organize them, she curated them. She picked up each piece of fabric, smoothing it with the flat of her palms, feeling the grain of the weave and the weight of the thread. Some pieces were stiff, others had the softness of a well-loved sheet. She aligned the edges with a slow, deliberate precision, creating a gradient of textures that invited a touch. There was a meditative quality to the smoothing, a way of erasing the creases of the world and replacing them with a blank, tactile slate. A sudden, sharp scent of oversteeped herbs hit her. Amara glanced at the clock and realized the tea had been sitting too long. The gold had deepened into a darker, more aggressive amber. With a quick but steady motion, she lifted the pot from the infuser, pouring the liquid into the warmed cups. She tasted a drop. It was on the verge of bitterness. She didn't panic, but she felt a small flicker of tension in her chest, a remnant of her teaching days when a missed minute meant a lost lesson. She breathed through it, a slow, expanding inhale that pushed the tension down into her heels, reminding herself that in this house the clock was a suggestion, not a master. From the oven, the scent of honey cakes began to bloom. It was a heavy, caramelized fragrance that seemed to thicken the air, smelling of toasted butter and wildflower nectar. Amara opened the oven door a crack, and a cloud of warmth rolled out, enveloping her in a humid, sweet embrace. The cakes were puffing upward, their edges browning to a deep russet. She watched them for a moment, the slow rise of the batter mirroring the slow rise of her own anticipation. These cakes were Fatima's favorite, and the scent alone was usually enough to make the others drop their guard the moment they entered the hallway. Amara stepped back and closed her eyes. She stood in the center of the living room, the silence of the house humming around her. She took a deep, rhythmic breath, counting to 4 on the inhale and 6 on the exhale, consciously slowing her pulse to match the cadence of the room. She wanted to be a mirror of the peace she expected from her friends. If she arrived at the circle already centered, she could catch the restlessness of others, like Gisella's habitual tapping or Hestia's impatient energy, and gently pull them into the orbit of the slow life. As she reached for the oven mitts to retrieve the cakes, she noticed one of them had slumped in the center, a small concave dip where the batter hadn't quite held its height. For a second, the old teacher in her wanted to correct it, to hide the flaw or apologize for it. but as she studied the golden brown imperfection, she felt a sudden wave of tenderness. The slump was human. It was a sign that the kitchen was a place of living, not a laboratory of precision. She decided to leave it exactly as it was, a small, edible piece of honesty to be shared among friends. She placed the cakes on a cooling rack, the honey still sizzling slightly on the surface. She arranged the teacups in a circle on the low coffee table, ensuring the handles all pointed outward, a small gesture of welcome that required no words. The house was now a sanctuary, a carefully constructed bubble of sensory warmth. She felt a quiet pride in the preparation. The environment was the first stitch of the afternoon, the invisible thread that would bind the group together before a single needle touched the fabric. Then, the silence was broken. From the driveway, the distinct, rhythmic crunch of gravel under a tire echoed through the open window. Amara didn't rush to the door. She remained still for a heartbeat longer, savoring the final second of absolute solitude, her hand resting on the cool cedar of the tray. The first arrival had come, and the slow movement of the afternoon was finally shifting into motion. The arrival of rhythms. The front door opened with a sharp, decisive snap of the latch, and Gisela Vogel stepped across the threshold. She didn't so much enter the room as she occupied it, her posture as rigid as a wound-watched spring, her spine a plumb line that refused to lean. The click of her heels on the hardwood was a metronome set to a frantic tempo, slicing through the lingering silence of the house. She carried her handbag like a shield, clutching the leather handle with a grip that left her knuckles white. "You're early, Gisela," Amara said, her voice a low, melodic current that sought to smooth the jagged edges of the other woman's energy. She didn't move toward her with urgency. Instead, she let the greeting hang in the air, a soft invitation to slow down. Amara noticed immediately the rhythmic staccato drumming of Gisela's index finger against the side of her bag, tap, 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 tap. It was the sound of a mind still calculating seconds, still measuring the world in increments of precision and efficiency. The traffic was non-existent. "I thought it more prudent to arrive before the appointed hour than to risk a late entry due to unforeseen variables," Gisela replied. Her voice was crisp, each consonant a polished stone. She looked around the room, her eyes scanning the arrangement of the teacups and the cooling honey cakes. To Gisela, a room was not a sanctuary but a series of alignments. She shifted her weight, her gaze lingering on the slightly asymmetrical placement of the cooling rack. Amara smiled, a slow, contented blink of her eyes. She stepped forward, the fabric of her linen dress whispering against her legs, and placed a hand lightly on Gisela's shoulder. She felt the muscle there tight, a knotted cord of tension. "The variables have all settled, Gisela. The tea is steeping, and the clock has no authority here. Leave the precision at the door. We are here for the drift." Before Gisela could respond with a logical rebuttal, the air in the hallway shifted. A new scent arrived first, warm cinnamon and the deep, earthy sweetness of cardamom, followed by a rich, bubbling laugh that seemed to expand the walls of the cottage. Fatima al-Sayed entered the room like a sudden burst of sunlight through a cloud, her presence softening the rigid geometry Gisela had brought with her. She wore a shawl of deep indigo, the edges frayed in a way that suggested a long history of being wrapped around loved ones. "Amara, my dear, the scent of your honey cakes reached me halfway down the lane," Fatima exclaimed, her voice rich and honeyed, carrying a gentle cadence that acted as a balm. She crossed the room in a fluid motion, enveloping Amara in a hug that smelled of spice and old books. As she pulled away, she turned to Gisela with a knowing glint in her eye. And Gisela, looking as though she is ready to synchronize the entire village to a single heartbeat. "Come, let us breathe." As Fatima settled her things on the side table, a sudden sharp chill sliced through the room. A rogue breeze had pushed through the open window, carrying the scent of damp earth and the sharp tang of an approaching rain. The gold and sage warmth of the living room flickered, the temperature dropping just enough to make the skin on Amara's arms prickle. The sanctuary had been breached by the raw, unpredictable outdoors. Amara moved with a slow, deliberate grace toward the window. She didn't rush the task, she treated the movement as a meditation. She grasped the heavy velvet curtains, thick, moss-green fabric that felt like dampened earth between her fingers, and drew them shut with a singular, sweeping motion. The sound was a muffled thud, a sonic seal that blocked out the gray light of the afternoon. The room instantly transformed into a cocoon of gold and sage, the light filtering through the fabric in soft, muted gradients that blurred the sharp corners of the furniture. Gisela, however, could not remain still. While the others drifted toward the center of the room, she migrated toward the tray of fabric scraps. The pieces of linen, silk, and wool were piled in a colorful, chaotic heap scraps of cornflower blue, burnt sienna, and a pale, ghostly cream. Gisella's brow furrowed. Without a word, she began to shift them. Her fingers moved with the speed of a watchmaker, aligning the edges of the squares into perfect right angles, creating a grid of efficiency where there had been a tumble of art. The organization of the materials facilitates a more streamlined workflow, Gisella murmured, her finger still tapping a rhythmic beat against the wooden tray. She was attempting to impose order on the chaos, her need for precision clashing visibly with the languid atmosphere Amara had cultivated. To Gisella, the heap was a problem to be solved. To Amara, it was a landscape to be explored. Amara watched her for a moment, not with judgment, but with a quiet, patient observation. She stepped toward Gisella and gently placed a hand over the woman's tapping finger, stilling the motion. The fabric doesn't want to be streamlined, Gisella. It wants to be felt. Come, the chairs are calling. Amara steered the group toward the cluster of oversized armchairs, each draped in a different hand-woven throw. She encouraged them to sink into the cushions, to let the furniture take the full weight of their bodies. For a few seconds, Gisella resisted, hovering on the edge of the seat as if she might need to spring up at any moment. But as the warmth of the cinnamon tea began to fill the air and the muted light of the velvet curtains settled over them, a visible change occurred. Gisella's shoulders, which had been hiked up toward her ears, finally dropped. She exhaled a long, shuddering breath, and the rigid line of her spine curved, finally yielding to the softness of the upholstery. Fatima leaned back with a contented sigh, her head tilting as she watched the dust motes dance in a sliver of light. The room had reached a state of equilibrium. The frantic energy of the arrival had been absorbed by the stillness of the house, replaced by a shared, heavy comfort. They sat in a circle of silence for a moment, the only sound the distant, muffled rhythm of the rain beginning to tap against the glass. Amara reached for the first piece of linen, a square of cream-colored fabric that felt like a dried petal. She threaded her needle with a slow, mindful precision, the silver eye catching a glint of gold light. She positioned the needle over the fabric, her breath evening out into a slow, rhythmic cycle. Then the silence was punctuated by a sharp, distinct click. The needle pierced the linen, the sound echoing in the quiet room like a starting gun fired in slow motion. It was the first stitch of the afternoon, a physical anchor that tied the three women to the present moment. As the thread pulled through the fabric, creating a tiny, honest pucker in the weave, the world outside the velvet curtains ceased to exist. There was only the scent of honey, the warmth of the tea, and the slow, steady pull of the thread through the cloth. The first cream stitch. This piece, Amara said, her voice a low, melodic drawl that seemed to pull the air closer to the center of the room, is the beginning of everything. She held the cream-colored linen square between her thumb and forefinger, the fabric so thin it looked like a translucent skin. It didn't just sit in her hand, it draped, yielding to the gravity of the room. The light from the window caught the weave, revealing a slight irregularity in the thread, a human flaw that made the linen feel lived in and honest. Amara didn't hand it over immediately. Instead, she smoothed it with her palm, a slow, grounding gesture that signaled the transition from the social noise of arrival to the sacred silence of the work. She positioned the fabric over her lap, the cream color contrasting with the deep mahogany of her skirt. With a movement that felt more like a dance than a chore, she slid the needle through the eye of the linen. "We aren't aiming for a line," she explained, her cadence slowing further, punctuating the words with soft pauses. "We are aiming for a breath. Watch the loop." Amara pushed the needle down, pausing at the apex of the curve. She didn't pull the thread through immediately. She waited. She took a full, deep inhalation, her chest expanding slowly, and only as she exhaled did she draw the thread through the cloth. The resulting stitch was a soft, rounded swell, a tiny hill of cream thread that looked less like a seam and more like a ripple in a still pond. Gisella watched the demonstration with a gaze that remained surgically precise. To her, the loop was a variable that needed defining. She picked up her own piece of fabric, a stiff, geometric scrap of gray silk, and gripped the needle with a tension that turned her knuckles white. Her first few stitches were not breaths, they were staccato bursts. Click, click, click. The needle moved in short, jerky increments, her wrist flicking with the ghost of a watchmaker's precision. She wasn't feeling the fabric, she was measuring it. In her mind, she was likely calculating the exact millimeter of the stitch, trying to replicate the visual output of Amara's work without adopting the internal rhythm that produced it. "It's too tight, Gisella," Amara said, not looking up from her own work. The observation wasn't a critique, but a simple statement of fact, as neutral as noting the time of day. Gisela paused, her finger hovering over the gray silk. She looked down to see that her haste had betrayed her. The thread had pulled the silk inward, creating a harsh, pinched pucker that distorted the straight edge of the fabric. The silk looked strangled. Gisela's brow furrowed, a flicker of the old professional frustration crossing her face. The sudden, jarring realization that the tool was not obeying the operator. She started to pull at the thread to undo it, her movements abrupt, but Amara reached out and gently covered Gisela's hand with her own. "Don't fight the fabric," Amara murmured. "If you pull too hard, the cloth remembers the tension. Let the thread sit on the surface first. Trust the slack." Amara guided Gisela's hand, showing her how to ease the tension, allowing the thread to lounge across the silk before securing it. It was a lesson in surrender. For a moment, Gisela stayed frozen under Amara's touch, her breath held, until the physical warmth of the other woman's hand seeped through her skin. Slowly, the rigid line of Gisela's shoulders dipped again, and she let out a breath that sounded like a long-held secret finally being told. As the women settled into a shared cadence, the silence of the room began to shift. It was no longer an empty void, but a vessel being filled by a rhythmic, mechanical pulse. The grandfather clock in the corner, a towering piece of dark oak with a brass pendulum that sliced through the air like a slow-motion scythe, began to dominate the auditory landscape. Tick, tock. The sound was heavy and resonant, echoing off the velvet curtains and the polished floorboards. It became a metronome for the room, a hypnotic heartbeat that seemed to synchronize with the movement of the needles. Each click of a needle passing through cloth landed precisely between the ticks of the clock, creating a soft, percussive layer of sound that wrapped around them like a blanket. Fatima leaned into the rhythm, her head tilting slightly to the side. She wasn't just stitching, she was humming a low, wordless melody that vibrated in the back of her throat, a sound that blended seamlessly with the ticking clock. Her hands moved with a fluid, effortless grace, the needle gliding through her fabric as if it were water. Amara observed them from the periphery of her vision. Gisela's movements were slowing, the jerky bursts smoothing into a steady flow, and Fatima was already deep in a meditative state. Their breathing was not yet in unison, but the frantic, jagged energy that Gisela had brought through the front door had been neutralized, dissolved by the repetitive motion and the scent of honeycakes cooling on the sideboard. The piece was punctuated by the sound of the front door creaking open and the light, hurried footsteps of a person who had forgotten the rules of the house. Hestia entered the room, her cheeks flushed from the wind and her wide eyes darting across the scene. She carried a small basket of fabric scraps, the colors a vivid, chaotic contrast to the muted tones of the living room. Electric blues, searing oranges, and deep violets. She stopped at the edge of the circle, her chest heaving slightly, her fingers already twitching with the urge to start. She studied the cream-colored linen in Amara's lap, and then at her own bright scraps, her expression one of intense, hungry curiosity. "I'm sorry I'm late," Hestia whispered, though her voice had a rising inflection of wonder that betrayed her excitement. She didn't sit immediately. She hovered, watching the way the needles moved in the dim light. To Hestia, the slow pace of the ritual looked like a challenge, a puzzle to be solved. She wanted to see the finished quilt, to see the grand architecture of the combined memories, but the ritual demanded she focus only on the single, solitary stitch. She sank into the remaining armchair, her movements lacking the heaviness of the others, her energy still buzzing like a live wire. Amara handed Hestia a needle and a length of thread, her eyes meeting the girl's with a quiet, knowing intensity. "The goal is not the quilt, Hestia," Amara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The goal is the moment the needle disappears into the cloth." Hestia nodded quickly, almost too quickly, and immediately plunged her needle into a piece of vibrant blue silk. She moved with a speed that threatened to break the spell of the room, her stitches coming fast and shallow, a frantic attempt to reach the end of the row. She was stitching for the result, while the others were stitching for the process. Amara didn't correct her. She simply closed her eyes for a few seconds, listening to the friction of the thread and the steady, relentless swing of the pendulum. She could feel the tension in the room shifting again, the introduction of Hestia's youth acting as a catalyst, a reminder of the restlessness they all once possessed. The air felt thicker, charged with the contrast between the slow, heavy peace of the elders and the electric impatience of the girl. It was a fragile equilibrium, a balance held together by nothing more than a few strands of cotton and the willingness to sit still. As the hour struck, the grandfather clock let out a deep, resonant chime. The sound vibrated through the floorboards and into the soles of their feet, a physical wave of sound that seemed to command a total cessation of movement. Simultaneously, as if choreographed by an invisible hand, all four women exhaled. It was a collective, shuddering release of breath that left the room feeling suddenly empty and vast. In the wake of the chime, a profound stillness settled over them. A silence so heavy it felt tactile, like a layer of dust settling over the furniture. They remained motionless for a long minute. The only sound the distant, rhythmic drumming of the rain against the glass. Amara looked at the cream-colored square, now marked by a few honest, slow stitches. She wondered if the stillness they had found was a destination or merely a doorway. As she glanced toward the velvet curtains, she noticed a slight shimmer in the fabric, a movement that didn't match the wind outside, as if something were pressing against the cloth from the other side, waiting for the silence to break. Silk and sun-drenched gardens. The shimmer behind the velvet curtains didn't vanish. It settled into a heavy, expectant stillness that seemed to pull the air from the room. Amara didn't move, her needle poised a fraction of an inch above the cream-colored fabric. The silence was no longer a void, but a presence, a held breath shared by the four women, and whatever lingered on the other side of the heavy fabric. Hestia, whose energy had been a frantic buzz only moments before, sat frozen, her wide eyes darting from the curtains to Amara, her mouth slightly open as if she were tasting the tension in the air. It was Fatima who broke the spell, though not with a word. She reached into the weathered leather basket at her feet, and withdrew a piece of silk that seemed to carry its own internal light. It was a deep iridescent emerald, shot through with veins of gold that shifted and swirled as she unfolded it across her lap. The fabric didn't just catch the dim light of the cottage, it seemed to amplify it, casting a soft, verdant glow onto the wool of her skirt. The sight of it acted as a grounding wire, pulling the group's collective attention away from the window and back into the center of the circle. "My mother kept this in a cedar chest for 40 years, Fatima said, her voice rich and honeyed, the cadence slowing as she smoothed the silk with a palm. "It is not just cloth. It is a map of a place that no longer exists in the way I remember it." Amara felt the tension in her own shoulders dissolve, replaced by a curiosity that felt like a slow warming of the skin. She watched Fatima's fingers, brown, lined with age, and steady traced the gold threads. The room, which had felt small and claustrophobic under the pressure of the unknown visitor at the window, suddenly felt as if the walls were receding, expanding to make room for a memory. "There was a garden," Fatima continued, her eyes drifting shut, her voice trailing off into a rhythmic hum. "In the center of the city, tucked behind a wall of limestone that stayed cool even in the height of July. I remember the scent of the night-blooming night bloom scent. Not just a smell, but a weight in the air thick and sweet, like syrup. It would cling to your hair and your skin long after you left the gate. We had a fountain there, too, a small thing made of chipped marble, where the water didn't splash so much as it sighed. A constant, low murmur that drowned out the noise of the street vendors and the distant horns of the cars." Amara closed her eyes. She stopped stitching entirely, letting her needle rest. She allowed Fatima's voice to become the only architecture of the room. She could almost smell the night bloom scent, a scent that felt heavy and humid, evoking images of damp earth and the coolness of stone. She felt her own heart rate decelerate, syncing with the slow, steady voice of Fatima's storytelling. The rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock became a secondary pulse, a distant heartbeat that underscored the vividness of the garden. Beside her, Inara had drifted. Her head tilted slightly to the left, her gaze unfocused, lost in the sensory wake of the narrative. Inara's needle, however, continued to move. It was a subconscious dance, the silver point dipping in and out of the fabric with a blind, intuitive grace. She was no longer consciously participating in the ritual, she had become a passenger in Fatima's memory, her body continuing the work of the hands while her mind wandered through the limestone walls and the sighing water of a distant city. Fatima's voice dipped, the honey turning to a darker, more bittersweet shade. "There was a gate," she whispered, her rhythm faltering. "A wrought iron gate with vines of bougainvillea that had grown so thick they had practically welded the bars shut. I spent hours trying to push through them, wanting to see what lay beyond the wall, believing that the garden was the whole world." Her voice wavered, a thin tremor of melancholy vibrating through the syllables. For a moment the image of the garden flickered, the vivid green fading into the gray of loss. Amara reached out, her movements slow and deliberate. She didn't speak, words would have been a clumsy intrusion, but she let her hand graze Fatima's forearm. The contact was light, a mere suggestion of presence, but it was enough. She felt the slight jump of Fatima's muscle under her touch, a physical acknowledgement of the support. The touch was an anchor pulling Fatima back from the edge of the grief and grounding her in the warmth of the cottage, surrounded by the scent of oversteeped tea and old wool. Fatima opened her eyes and offered a small, fragile smile. She looked down at the emerald silk, her thumb pressing into the gold thread. The melancholy didn't vanish, but it transformed into something more complex, a quiet curiosity. But the gate was not just a barrier, Fatima said, her voice regaining its richness, though now laced with a hint of mystery. One afternoon, when the sun was hitting the limestone at just the right angle to make the stone look like gold, I found a loose slat in the fence. I crawled through, skinning my knee on the gravel, and I found something tucked into the roots of an old pomegranate tree. It was a small lacquered box, half buried in the soil. Amara leaned in, her breath catching. The circle had shifted. The slow, somniferous peace of the afternoon had evolved into a shared secret. Even Hestia had stopped her frantic stitching, her chin resting in her palms, her wide eyes locked on Fatima. The room felt suspended, a bubble of intimacy where time had ceased to function linearly. The only sound was the distant rain and the soft, rhythmic breathing of the four women. I didn't open the box for 3 days, Fatima continued, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. I kept it under my mattress, feeling the weight of it against my spine every night. When I finally did open it, I found the remnants of a letter and a piece of silk exactly like this one, though it had been torn in half. The letter wasn't a love note, nor was it a map. It was a confession. Fatima paused, the silence stretching out, heavy and expectant. She didn't immediately reveal the nature of the confession. Instead, she began to stitch, the needle piercing the emerald silk with a slow, deliberate precision. The act of stitching now felt like a way of weaving the secret into the fabric, making the mystery a physical part of the quilt. Amara watched the needle move, feeling a strange tension coil in her stomach. The sanctuary of the cottage, with its soft upholstery and rhythmic clocks, had suddenly become a vessel for a story that felt too large for the room. She looked back at the velvet curtains. The shimmer was gone, or perhaps it had simply merged with the dimming light of the afternoon, but the feeling of being watched remained, as if the house itself were leaning in to hear the end of the tale. The confession, Fatima said, her voice barely audible over the rain, was about why the garden had been hidden from the rest of the city. It wasn't to protect the flowers, but to hide the person who had planted them. As Fatima fell silent, the chime of a smaller clock in the hallway rang out, a thin, silver sound that sliced through the atmosphere. The spell wasn't broken, but it had shifted. The comfort of the slow afternoon had been replaced by a quiet, humming electricity. Amara looked at the emerald silk and realized that the quilt was no longer just a collection of memories. It was becoming a ledger of secrets, and the weight of the fabric in their laps felt suddenly, inexplicably, heavier. The curve of the thread. Gisela stopped mid-stitch, the needle suspended like a frozen pendulum. She leaned in, her nose inches from the linen, and let out a sharp, clipped exhale. The line of cream-colored thread she had just laid down was off by perhaps a millimeter, a slight deviation that skewed the intended geometry of the border. To anyone else, it was a ghost of a mistake, but to a woman who had spent 40 years adjusting the hairsprings of Swiss chronometers, it was a scream in a silent room. "It's wrong," Gisela whispered, her voice returning to that crisp, metal-sharp edge. She didn't look up, but her right index finger began to tap a rapid staccato rhythm against the mahogany side table. Tap, 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 dot apache. The sound was a clock ticking too fast, a frantic heartbeat echoing through the stillness of the cottage. She reached for the small seam ripper in her kit, her movements precise and clinical, intending to excise the error with surgical efficiency. Amara shifted in her chair, the movement fluid and unhurried. She rose and drifted behind Gisela, her presence announced only by the faint scent of dried lavender and old books. She didn't reach for the fabric immediately. Instead, she stood in the quiet space between the chair and the window, allowing the silence to settle. When she finally spoke, her voice was a low, melodic hum that seemed to vibrate in the air rather than travel through it. "Leave the thread be, Gisela," Amara said, the words trailing off into a soft pause. "The ruler is a fine tool for a watch, but the linen has its own mind. It breathes. It pulls. If you fight the grain, the fabric will only tighten against you." Gisela stiffened, a visible knot of tension tightening in the cord of her neck. She didn't move the seam ripper away from the cloth. Precision is not a fight, Amara. It is a standard. If the foundation is skewed, the entire structure is compromised. I cannot simply ignore a deviation. Her finger continued its rhythmic drumming on the wood, a nervous energy that clashed violently with the somniferous weight of the room. She felt the phantom pressure of a deadline, a ghostly ticking of a clock that no longer existed in this village, demanding a perfection that left no room for breath. Amara leaned forward, not to correct the stitch, but to ground the woman. She placed her palm gently over Gisella's hand, her skin warm and steady. The touch was not a grip, but a soft weight, a physical anchor. The heat of Amara's hand seeped through Gisella's skin, momentarily interrupting the staccato tapping of her finger. The room seemed to contract, the distance between the two women vanishing into a shared point of focus. "Slower," Amara whispered, her voice barely a breath. "Forget the line you intended. Feel the line the fabric wants to take." Amara didn't pull the needle, she simply slowed the movement of Gisella's hand to a crawl. The pace became agonizingly deliberate, almost static. For a moment Gisella resisted, her muscles coiled like a wound spring, her mind calculating the loss of time and the accumulation of error. But as the seconds stretched, the forced deceleration acted as a solvent. The frantic internal noise began to dim. Forced to move at a glacial pace, Gisella stopped looking at the stitch as a coordinate on a grid and began to feel the organic, undulating curve of the linen under her fingertips. She noticed the way the weave shifted slightly, a natural ripple in the cloth that the rigid line would have ignored. Slowly, the rhythm of Gisella's chest began to shift. She had been breathing in shallow, jagged sips, but now, influenced by the steady, deep cadence of Amara's presence, her lungs expanded fully. She let out a long, shaky breath, a sound like a collapsing bellows that she hadn't realized she was holding. The knot in her neck dissolved, her shoulders dropping an inch as the phantom clock in her head finally stopped ticking. Under their shared grip, the fabric seemed to change. The rigidity of the starched linen softened, becoming supple and yielding, as if the material itself had been waiting for Gisella to stop fighting it. The tension vanished, replaced by a tactile warmth that made the act of stitching feel less like assembly and more like a conversation. Gisella felt a strange, floating sensation, a lightness that made the mahogany chair feel less like a seat and more like a cloud. From the other side of the circle, Amara began to hum. It wasn't a melody with a beginning or an end, but a low, grounding note that resonated in the hollows of the armchairs. The vibration traveled through the wood and the velvet, a sonic blanket that wrapped around the group. The sound anchored the moment, turning the small cottage into a sanctuary where the only requirement was existence. Gisella blinked, her gaze finally drifting away from the need for a ruler. She looked down at the cream-colored thread. The line was indeed curved, slightly asymmetrical, and entirely imprecise by the standards of her former life. Yet, as she studied it, she realized that the imperfection gave the border a living quality, a softness that mirrored the curve of a river or the edge of a cloud. It was more beautiful than a straight line because it was honest. It acknowledged the nature of the material it lived in. She felt a small, genuine smile tug at the corners of her mouth, a rare loosening of her habitual mask. But as she shifted her hand to continue the stitch, her needle caught on something. She paused, frowning. A stray piece of deep indigo thread, thick and textured unlike her own fine cream silk, had somehow wound itself into her section of the quilt. It wasn't just a loose end, it was tangled, a knot of midnight blue entwined with her pale line, as if two different stories had collided in the middle of a sentence. Gisella looked across the circle. The indigo thread belonged to Fatima's section, a fragment of the heritage fabric that had been discussed earlier. The thread had traveled, drifting across the gap between their chairs, weaving itself into Gisella's work without either of them noticing. It was a physical manifestation of the secrets Fatima had been unraveling, a tangible link between the hidden gardener and the watchmaker. Amara noticed the blue thread too. She didn't move to remove it. Instead, she watched Gisella's expression, her eyes twinkling with a quiet, knowing light. The silence returned, but it was no longer the silence of a vacuum. It was the heavy, expectant silence of a ledger being opened. Gisella stared at the indigo knot, feeling the weight of the fabric in her lap shift once more, as if the quilt were pulling her deeper into a mystery she wasn't sure she was ready to solve. The indigo silence. Gisella's fingers hovered over the indigo knot, the needle poised like a surgical instrument. To pull the thread was to restore order, to return the quilt to the precise geometry of its design. To leave it was to accept a smudge on the blueprint. She studied Fatima, whose hands had fallen still in her lap, and then at Amara, who remained unnervingly quiet. The air in the cottage had thickened, the scent of dried lavender and old cedar becoming a heavy, aromatic blanket that seemed to dampen the very sound of their breathing. Before Gisela could make her move, Hiroshi shifted. He had been a statue for the better part of an hour, his presence less like a person and more like a piece of well-placed furniture. Without a word, he reached into the deep pocket of his linen apron and withdrew a fold of fabric. He didn't announce it, he didn't ask for permission, he simply leaned forward and placed the cloth in the center of the circle, resting it upon the low mahogany table where a stray saucer of tea still steamed. It was indigo. Not the bright synthetic blue of a denim jacket, but a deep midnight hue, the color of the sky 10 minutes before the first star dares to pierce the dark. The fabric was heavy, a hand-dyed cotton that seemed to absorb the light of the room rather than reflect it. As it settled onto the wood, the silence that followed wasn't a gap in conversation. It was a physical entity, a weight that pressed against their chests and slowed the rhythm of their pulses. Amara watched the fabric, her palms smoothing the cream silk in her own lap in a slow, rhythmic motion. She felt the shift in the room's gravity. Usually, she was the one providing the scaffolding for the others, the tea, the encouraging words, the gentle guidance of the breath. But Hiroshi's silence was a different kind of gift. It was a void, and in that void, Amara found a sudden, profound relief. She realized that for years she had used her voice to curate the comfort of others, weaving a safety net of melodic reassurance. In the presence of Hiroshi's absolute stillness, the need to perform the role of the caretaker vanished. She didn't have to fill the air. She could simply be a part of the silence. Fatima tilted her head, her gaze locked on the indigo cloth. The rich color mirrored the thread that had wandered into Gisela's section, and for a moment the two women shared a look of quiet recognition. There was a secret in that blue, something old and salted, like a memory of a coastline far from Oakhaven. Fatima didn't speak, but her slow, rhythmic nod suggested that the arrival of the fabric was not an accident, but a punctuation mark in a conversation they hadn't yet learned how to voice. Hiroshi began to work. His movements were so deliberate they felt choreographed. He didn't rush to the center, he waited, allowing the indigo cloth to settle, and the group to synchronize their breathing to the ticking of the grandfather clock. When he finally picked up his needle, the sound of the thread passing through the heavy cotton was a distinct, tactile, a shook, a small rhythmic punctuation that echoed in the hush. He wasn't just sewing, he was meditating with a needle, each stitch a conscious decision to remain in the present moment. As the minutes stretched, the silence grew heavier, enveloping the circle like a physical shroud. The room seemed to shrink, the walls drawing closer until the only thing that existed was the circle of armchairs and the deepening blue of the center fabric. The scent of honey cakes, left cooling on a side table, drifted through the air, sweet and cloying, grounding the ethereal silence in something edible and earthy. Amara felt her eyelids grow heavy, the slow cadence of the afternoon pulling her toward a state of waking sleep. Then came the friction. Hestia shifted in her seat, the velvet of the armchair letting out a sharp, protesting creak. The girl's youthful energy, usually a bright spark in the room, was now a jagged edge. She shifted her weight again, her chin resting in her palms, her eyes darting from the indigo cloth to the clock and back again. For Hestia, the silence wasn't a sanctuary, it was a vacuum. She looked as though she were holding her breath, her shoulders hunched, her foot tapping a frantic, silent rhythm against the rug. The stillness had become an oppressive weight, a demand for a patience she hadn't yet mastered. She opened her mouth to say something, perhaps to ask why they were suddenly acting like statues, or to complain that the room felt too quiet, but the words died in her throat. Hiroshi didn't look up from his stitching, but he sensed the turbulence. He paused, his needle suspended a fraction of an inch above the indigo surface. Slowly, he lifted his gaze and caught Hestia's eye. He didn't smile, and he didn't frown. He simply gave a single, slow blink. It was a gesture of immense economy, a silent invitation that said, "Stop fighting the quiet. Sink into it." Hestia froze. She stared at him, her wide eyes blinking back. The singular blink seemed to act as a release valve. The tension in her shoulders dropped an inch, then two. She didn't stop being restless. She was too young for total stillness, but she stopped fighting the atmosphere. She leaned back into the velvet, her breathing slowing to match the rhythmic shuck of Hiroshi's needle. The circle closed again, the indigo fabric acting as the anchor for their collective consciousness. As the indigo section grew, the light in the cottage began to shift. The afternoon sun, which had been filtering through the lace curtains in pale gold shafts, turned a bruised purple, casting long, distorted shadows across the floorboards. The shift in light seemed to sharpen the other senses. With the visual noise dimmed and the vocal noise silenced, a new sound began to emerge from the periphery of their awareness. It started as a ghost of a sound, something Gisela almost dismissed as the blood rushing in her own ears. But then Amara heard it too. It was a low, humming vibration, a subterranean thrum that didn't come from the wind or the clock. It was coming from the walls themselves, a deep, resonant drone that felt as though the house were breathing in tandem with them. It was a sound of antiquity, a vibration that suggested something massive, and hidden was shifting beneath the floorboards or within the very bones of the cottage. Gisela looked down at the indigo knot in her lap. The vibration seemed to travel up through the fabric, a tiny electric shiver that made the thread dance against her skin. She looked toward the curtains where the movement from earlier had been noted and felt a sudden, sharp prickle of awareness. The silence hadn't brought peace. It had simply cleared the air so they could finally hear the house speaking. The humming grew slightly louder, a steady, rhythmic pulse that matched the beating of a heart, slow and ancient, echoing from a place they had not yet dared to look. A lean of shoulders. Imagine a library where the books aren't written in ink, but in distillations, Amara whispered, her voice barely a ripple in the heavy air. She hadn't looked up from her stitching in several minutes. Her eyes were glazed, fixed on a point somewhere beyond the velvet curtains and the bruising purple of the twilight. A shelf of old cedar and rain. A volume that smells of crushed mint and sun-baked clay. You wouldn't read them with your eyes, you would just breathe, and the memory would unfold in your chest, complete and heavy. Amara paused, her needle hovering. The low, subterranean thrum of the house continued to vibrate through the soles of her slippers, a rhythmic pulse that felt like the slow turning of a great rusted wheel deep in the earth. Around them, the circle had fallen into a shared hypnotic trance. Fatima was nodding in a slow, rhythmic arc, her fingers moving with a subconscious grace over a swatch of saffron silk. Hiroshi had closed his eyes entirely, his breath a thin, silver thread of sound that synchronized with the ticking of the grandfather clock. The air in the room had grown thick, smelling of the honey cakes Fatima had brought, and the faint, metal-sharp scent of the coming damp. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Inara shifted. The movement was a gradual migration of weight, a soft lean that culminated in the warm, solid pressure of her shoulder against Amara's. It was a tentative contact, a question asked in the language of fabric and skin. Amara froze. The sudden proximity sent a jolt through her, triggering the ingrained machinery of the hostess. Her mind immediately catalogued the needs of the room. The tea in the pot was likely lukewarm by now. Hestia's posture was slouching, which would lead to a backache. Gisela's stitching was perhaps too tight. The urge to stand, to adjust the cushions, to flutter about the room and curate the comfort of others, rose up in her like a tide. "Stay," a smaller, quieter voice commanded. "Just for a moment, stop managing the world." Amara consciously relaxed her shoulder, allowing herself to sink into Inara's warmth. She felt the tension in her trapezius muscle dissolve, a slow melting that mirrored the softening of the light in the room. For decades, Amara had been the anchor, the one who smoothed the edges and filled the silences, the teacher who ensured every child had a pencil and every guest had a coaster. She had built a life out of the architecture of care, but in doing so, she had become a permanent sentinel, always on watch for the first sign of someone else's discomfort. To be the one leaning, to be the one held felt like a transgression against her own nature. She closed her eyes and focused on the point of contact. Inara smelled of crushed lavender and the old paper scent of the library, a fragrance that seemed to anchor Amara to the present moment. The subterranean hum of the house seemed to harmonize with this physical connection, the vibration traveling from the floor, through the chair, and into the shared heat of their shoulders. It was a grounding weight, a reminder that she was not merely a facilitator of peace, but a participant in it. The sense would be the truth of things, Inara continued, her voice dropping even lower, a conspiratorial murmur that seemed to pull the others closer. No one can lie with a smell. You can't pretend a memory is happy if it smells of brine and cold iron. Fatima let out a soft, honeyed sigh. "Like the saffron of my mother's kitchen," she whispered, her voice rich and trailing. "It doesn't just smell of spice. It smells of safety. It smells of a door that is always unlocked." The conversation had shifted. It was no longer a social exchange of information or a lesson in craft. It had become a collective confession, a shared descent into the subconscious. The energy in the room had transitioned from the bright, active focus of the afternoon into something intimate and blurred, as if the boundaries between their individual selves were fraying like old lace. They were no longer 5 separate people in a cottage. They were a single, breathing entity, bound together by the indigo thread and the rhythmic shuck-shuck of the needles. Amara felt the weight of her responsibilities. The tea, the cakes, the social choreography simply slip away. It was as if the house itself, with its ancient, pulsing heart, was absorbing the burden from her. She felt a profound, dizzying lightness, a surrender she hadn't known she was craving. She studied the scrap of cream-colored linen resting across their laps, a piece of fabric that needed to be joined to the indigo section. Without a word, she slid the cloth toward Inara. Inara understood. She took a slow, deliberate stitch, pulling the thread through with a mindful precision. Then she paused and nudged the fabric back toward Amara. Amara followed, her needle diving and rising in a mirrored rhythm. They began to stitch the same piece of cloth in alternating turns, a slow, weaving dance of cooperation. Each stitch was a heartbeat. Each pull of the thread was a shared breath. There was no goal, no deadline, only the tactile sensation of the linen and the steady, warm pressure of Inara's shoulder. As the purple light outside deepened into a bruised charcoal, the room seemed to shrink, wrapping around them like a heavy blanket. Amara felt her eyelids grow heavy. The contentment was so thick it felt viscous, a golden syrup that slowed her thoughts and quieted the persistent hum of her anxiety. She allowed her head to tilt slightly, resting it against Inara's for a heartbeat, the silence of the room feeling like a sanctuary they had built together, stitch by stitch. Just as Amara began to fully surrender to the stillness, feeling the edges of her consciousness blur into the soft velvet of the armchair, she felt Inara's grip tighten. It wasn't a lean anymore, it was a clutch. Inara's fingers dug slightly into the fabric of Amara's cardigan, a sudden sharp tension that broke the spell of the collective trance. Amara didn't move, her breath catching in her throat. The subterranean humming of the house seemed to spike, a sudden crescendo of vibration that rattled the teacups on the low table. The air grew cold, a sudden draft cutting through the warmth of the circle, though the curtains remained still. Inara leaned in, her lips brushing the shell of Amara's ear. The warmth was still there, but the voice that emerged was no longer dreamy or distant. It was clear, urgent, and laced with a tremor that made Amara's heart skip a beat. "Amara," Inara whispered, the sound barely a ghost of a breath. "The humming, it isn't coming from the house, it's coming from the quilt." Amara looked down. In the dim purple light, the indigo section of the memory stitch wasn't just sitting in their laps. The fabric was pulsing. A slow, rhythmic ripple was moving across the surface of the cloth, a wave of motion that matched the beating of a heart, as if something living had been sewn into the very fibers of the memory. The patient unraveling. Hestia's needle didn't glide, it fought. She was working on a corner of a vivid, saffron-colored scrap, her small fingers moving with a frantic, stabbing energy that disrupted the heavy, honeyed silence of the room. While the others moved in a slow, tidal rhythm, Hestia was a hummingbird in a garden of stones. She wanted the corner finished. She wanted the edge crisp and the geometry perfect, a tangible trophy of her progress that she could hold up and claim as done. But the thread, a shimmering silver filament, had other plans. It snagged on a loose fiber of the saffron linen, looped once, twice, and then, in a sudden clumsy jerk of her wrist, it collapsed into a dense, irreducible knot. She froze. The knot was a small, ugly thing, a hard pearl of tangled silver that sat stubbornly atop the fabric. Hestia let out a sharp, jagged huff of air that sounded like a puncture in the room's collective peace. Her shoulders hiked toward her ears, and her fingers began to twitch, her nails digging into the palms of her hands. She didn't just want to fix it, she wanted to rip the entire section apart, to tear the fabric with a violent suddenness that would erase the failure entirely. The urge was visceral, a physical itch in her chest that demanded the destruction of the mistake. "It's ruined," Hestia whispered, her voice thin and brittle, lacking the soft curiosity she usually carried. "I've made a mess of it. It's just a knot, a stupid tight knot." Amara looked over, her gaze slow and steady. She didn't react to the sharpness of Hestia's tone with alarm, but rather with a deep, indulgent patience. Amara noticed the way Hestia's breath was coming in shallow, rapid sips, the girl's chest heaving slightly under her cotton tunic. The air in the cottage had grown thick and cool, smelling of old cedar and the lingering scent of Fatima's honey cakes, but Hestia seemed to be vibrating at a frequency that didn't belong in the room. Beside them, the indigo fabric continued its slow, rhythmic pulse, a heartbeat in the cloth, but Hestia was too consumed by her own frustration to notice the miracle in their laps. Amara didn't speak at first. Instead, she closed her eyes and began a low, humming melody. It wasn't a song with a beginning or an end, but a drone, a deep, resonant vibration that started in the base of her throat and radiated outward. It was a sound like a distant hive of bees or the low thrum of a cello played in a vaulted hall. The melody didn't demand attention. It simply occupied the space, filling the gaps between the ticking of the grandfather clock and the soft rustle of fabric. As the hum filled the air, the tension in the room seemed to shift. The sound acted as a sonic anchor, pulling the frantic energy out of Hestia's frame. Slowly, the girl's shoulders dropped an inch. Her breathing, which had been a series of sharp gasps, began to widen, syncing unconsciously with the slow, undulating wave of Amara's voice. Hestia's wide eyes drifted from the knot to Amara's face, seeing only the closed lids and the gentle, rhythmic movement of her throat. The hummingbird's wings slowed. The world stopped rushing toward a finish line that didn't actually exist. "Give it to me, Hestia," Amara said, her voice returning in that low, melodic cadence, barely breaking the spell of the hum. "Not to fix it for you, but to show you how to listen to the thread." Amara reached out and took the saffron scrap. She didn't reach for a pair of scissors to snip the knot away, the quick, efficient solution that Gisela might have preferred. Instead, Amara settled back into her armchair, the velvet upholstery sighing beneath her. She held the knot between two fingers, not pulling at it, but merely feeling its tension. Hestia leaned in, her chin resting in her palms, her eyes fixed on the silver tangle. "Most people think the goal is the stitch," Amara murmured, her thumb gently coaxing a single loop of silver thread. "They think the beauty is in the completion. But there is a different kind of peace in the unraveling. To undo something with patience is to honor the time it took to make the mistake." Amara began to work. Her movements were agonizingly slow. She didn't tug, she teased. She used the tip of a needle to nudge a single fiber, creating a microscopic gap, then breathed into that gap, allowing the thread to relax. It was a lesson in surrender. Hestia watched, mesmerized. She realized that the act of undoing was not a regression, but a meditation. Every time a loop gave way, a small, invisible weight seemed to lift from the room. The focus shifted from the end result, the finished corner, to the tactile sensory experience of the silver thread sliding against the saffron linen. The friction, the slight resistance, and the eventual satisfying glide of the thread being freed. As the minutes passed, Hestia felt a strange, sleepy curiosity wash over her. The urgency that had driven her since she first joined the circle began to dissolve. She watched the way Amara's palms smoothed the fabric, a slow, rhythmic gesture that felt like a benediction. Hestia stopped thinking about how the quilt would look when it was done. She only cared about the singular, silver loop currently being teased free. The world shrunk down to the size of a postage stamp, and in that smallness she found a profound sense of safety. "See?" Amara whispered, her voice a soft caress. "The thread remembers where it wants to go. You just have to stop shouting at it." With one final, delicate movement, the knot gave way. The silver thread straightened, returning to its original, fluid state. But as the knot vanished, something else became visible. Tucked deep within the fold of the saffron scrap, right where the knot had been anchored, was a small, hard protrusion. It was something that had been sewn into the fabric long before Hestia had ever touched it, a hidden passenger in the linen. Amara paused, her fingers hovering over the spot. She didn't pull the object out immediately. Instead, she watched Hestia, a glint of knowing in her eyes. The air in the room suddenly felt electric, the subterranean humming of the house rising in volume, echoing the heartbeat of the indigo cloth. The temperature dropped a few degrees, sending a sudden chill through the group, yet Hestia didn't shiver. She was too focused on the secret hidden in the saffron. Amara carefully pinched the fabric and drew out the object. It was a small, tarnished silver key, no longer than a fingernail, wrapped in a single ancient strand of silk. It hadn't been a mistake of the stitching, but a hidden intention. The key lay in Amara's palm, reflecting the bruised purple light of the evening, an invitation to a door that none of them had yet seen. "Some memories," Amara said, her voice trailing off into a thoughtful silence, "are not meant to be stitched in, but locked away until the right hand comes to unravel them." Inara leaned closer, her shoulder brushing Amara's, her eyes wide as she studied the tiny key. The peace of the room remained, but it was now layered with a heavy, shimmering mystery. Hestia reached out, her finger trembling slightly as she touched the cool metal of the key. She no longer wanted to finish the quilt. She wanted to know what the key opened and why it had been waiting for her to fail so that it could be found. The golden hour steep. The steam from the teapot rose in a thick, slow curl, catching a beam of sunlight that had turned the color of old honey. Amara poured the liquid with a steady hand, the sound a soft, rhythmic glug that filled the sudden silence of the room. She moved between the armchairs, the porcelain cups clicking faintly against their saucers. The tea was a blend of chamomile and dried lemon balm, smelling of damp earth and summer afternoons, and as she handed a cup to Gisela, she noticed the stillness in the other woman's hands. Gisela did not reach for the cup with her usual efficiency, that sharp clockmaker's precision that had defined her first few visits. Instead, she took the porcelain with both palms, cradling it as if it were a wounded bird. The rhythmic tapping of her index finger against the mahogany side table, a habit that had sounded like a frantic telegraph for hours, had simply stopped. Her shoulders, once pulled tight toward her ears, had dropped. She watched the amber liquid, her gaze soft and unfocused, her movements fluid and heavy, as if she were moving through warm water. "It tastes of sleep," Gisela murmured, her voice no longer a crisp, clear bell but a breathy hum. She took a sip, and the expression on her face was one of profound surrender. She didn't look at the quilt, nor at the silver key resting on the lace doily between them. She simply existed in the heat of the cup. Around them, the cottage had become a cathedral of gold. The late afternoon sun filtered through the linen curtains in thick, solid beams, illuminating millions of dust motes that danced in slow, chaotic spirals. The light didn't just illuminate the room, it seemed to occupy it, adding a physical weight to the air. Every object, the frayed edges of the velvet chairs, the chipped paint of the grandfather clock, the scattered remnants of saffron and indigo fabric, was gilded in a heavy, somniferous glow. The world outside the walls of the cottage felt distant and irrelevant, a blurred memory of a place where people rushed and clocks mattered. Fatima leaned back into her cushions, her head tilting slowly to the side. She didn't speak, but her rhythmic nodding mirrored the slow pulse of the house. Beside her, Inara had let her head drift toward Amara's shoulder, her fingers still twisting a stray piece of yarn, though the motion had slowed to a crawl. The only sound remaining was the occasional, rhythmic click of a needle, or the soft, collective sigh of 5 people breathing in a shared cadence. The air grew dense, saturated with the scent of honeycakes and the sharp tang of the silver key, creating a sensory blanket that pressed down on their eyelids. Amara felt the peace as a physical presence, a deep, heavy warmth that started in the center of her chest and radiated outward, seeping into her marrow. She watched Hestia, whose wide-eyed curiosity had finally succumbed to the atmosphere. The girl's chin had sunk into her palms, her gaze fixed on a single dust mote drifting toward the floor. Hestia's breathing had synchronized perfectly with the rest of them, a slow, oceanic rise and fall that seemed to pull the very walls of the room inward. "Is this the only way to truly hold a moment?" Amara wondered, her thoughts drifting like the steam from her own tea. "To let the edges of the self blur until there is no distinction between the breath in my lungs and the air in the room. We spend our lives stitching together fragments of time, trying to make a pattern that makes sense, but the real grace is in the unraveling. The key is here, the secret is out, and yet the mystery is smaller than the need for this stillness. I can feel the weight of the house leaning into us, asking us to simply stop. To stop wanting, to stop solving, to just be the fabric itself." She studied Inara, whose eyelashes were casting long, feathered shadows against her cheeks. The intimacy of the silence was more profound than any conversation they had shared. It was a trust born of shared exhaustion and shared comfort, a collective agreement to let the world wait. Amara closed her eyes for a moment, and the golden light burned through her eyelids in a soft, crimson haze. She felt as though she were floating in a vat of warm honey, the gravity of the cottage gently pulling her down into a state of half-wakefulness. One by one, the group began to nod. It wasn't a conscious descent into sleep, but a slow, magnetic surrender. Hiroshi's head dipped forward, his chin nearly touching his chest, his meditative silence now absolute. Gisela's grip on her teacup loosened, the porcelain tilting slightly, though she didn't seem to notice. The synchronization was complete. They were no longer 5 individuals with 5 different histories, but a single, breathing organism, anchored by the weight of the afternoon. Amara let her own head lean back against the upholstery. The ticking of the grandfather clock had become a heartbeat, slow and steady, marking a time that no longer felt linear. She felt the tension of the day, the friction of Gisella's arrival, the shock of the silver key, the struggle of the memory stitch. Evaporating like mist. There was only the warmth of the tea, the scent of old linen, and the heavy, golden pressure of the sun. As the sun finally dipped below the horizon, the gold vanished instantly, replaced by a bruised velvet twilight. The room plunged into a soft, dim blue, the transition so sudden it felt as though a curtain had been drawn across the world. The warmth remained, but the atmosphere shifted from the somnolence of day to the heavy mystery of night. The group remained in their stupor, caught in that fragile borderland between dreaming and waking, where the mind is open and the body is led. Then the silence was shattered. 3 sharp, insistent knocks sounded at the heavy oak door. The sound was violent in its clarity, a jagged tear in the fabric of their peace. It wasn't the gentle rap of a neighbor or the hesitant knock of a visitor. It was a demand. Amara bolted upright, her heart leaping into her throat, the sudden movement jarring her from the honey-thick haze. Beside her, Inara gasped, her eyes snapping open, while Gisela nearly dropped her cup, the tea splashing onto the saffron fabric of the quilt. The peaceful synchronization was gone, replaced by a sudden electric tension. They all looked toward the door, the silver key on the table suddenly gleaming in the twilight, as if responding to the arrival of whoever stood on the other side. The final soft fold. The knock had been a rupture, a violent jaggedness that left the room vibrating in its wake, but the visitor had not returned. The intruder, a distant cousin of Inara's who had arrived in a cloud of frantic apologies and a forgotten umbrella, had been ushered out as quickly as he had arrived, his chaos absorbed by the thick rugs and the patient silence of the house. Now, the twilight had deepened into a bruised plum, and the air in the cottage tasted of cold tea and the sharp tang of the silver key which sat motionless on the mahogany table. Amara did not move to touch the key. Instead, she fixed on the quilt, the saffron fabric still damp where Gisella's tea had splashed, a dark amber bloom that looked, in the dim light, like a map of a country they had all just visited together. "It is too heavy to leave scattered," Amara said, her voice low and melodic, the cadence slowing as if she were pulling a silk thread through a needle. "The day has been long. Let us put it to rest." She stood and moved to the center of the room, her palms flat against the expanse of the communal quilt. The fabric was warm, holding the residual heat of 5 different bodies and the friction of a dozen different anxieties. Amara began the final ritual, the rhythmic folding. It was not a chore of tidying, but a physical lullaby. She gripped the edges of the heavy cotton and linen, lifting the fabric with a slow, sweeping motion that displaced the scent of lavender and old cedar. The quilt billowed for a moment, a great, soft wing of memory, before she brought the corners together. Gisela watched her fingers still tapping a frantic, ghostly rhythm on the arm of her chair. But as Amara made the first fold, the tapping stopped. The sound of the fabric sliding against itself was a soft, shushing noise, like a distant tide pulling back from the shore. Amara folded the quilt in half, then in half again, her movements deliberate and symmetrical. Each crease was a commitment to stillness. She smoothed the fabric with her palms, the pressure firm and grounding, erasing the wrinkles of the afternoon's tension. The act was hypnotic. The others found themselves leaning forward, their breaths sinking once more to the slow, rhythmic descent of the cloth. Fatima leaned back in her chair, her head tilting slightly as she watched the saffron and indigo patterns disappear into the neat, square geometry of the fold. A look of total acceptance had settled over her features, softening the lines of a melancholy that had followed her for years across oceans and borders. For a long time, Fatima had treated this circle as a guest would, with gratitude, but with a suitcase always metaphorically packed. But as she watched the folded quilt and the tired, peaceful faces of the women around her, the expression on her face shifted. It was a quiet realization, a settling of a heavy stone. She didn't speak, but she let out a long, slow sigh that sounded like a door closing gently on a cold wind. She had stopped searching for a way back to a childhood home. She had simply realized she was sitting in it. "I think," Hestia whispered, her voice carrying a rising inflection of wonder, "that the quilt is breathing. Even folded, it feels like it's still awake." "It is resting," Hiroshi corrected, his voice an airy whisper that barely disturbed the dim light. He closed his eyes for several seconds, his hands resting motionless on his knees. The energy of the stitch does not vanish when the work stops, it only settles, like the sediment in a cup of tea. One by one, the group began to drift away. The departures were not abrupt, but lingering, as if leaving the room meant leaving a shared dream. Inara was the first to rise, her shoulder brushing against Amara's in a brief, tactile anchor. She didn't say a word, but she twisted a stray piece of yarn between her fingers and pressed a slow, lingering kiss to Amara's temple. The scent of damp earth and night bloom scent followed her out the door. Then when Hestia, her wide eyes still reflecting the blue twilight, and Hiroshi, whose departure was marked only by a slight, respectful bow of the head. Finally, it was Gisela. The former watchmaker stood before Amara, her posture still somewhat rigid, but the frantic energy of her arrival had been replaced by a fragile, transparent calm. She studied the silver key on the table, then back at Amara. For a moment, the old drive for efficiency flickered in her eyes. The urge to solve the mystery of the key, to categorize it, to find the lock it belonged to. But she blinked, and the urge vanished. She reached out and took Amara's hand, her grip surprisingly soft. "I forgot how to be tired," Gisela murmured, her voice a breathy hum. "Not the kind of tired that comes from working, but the kind that comes from stopping." "The best kind of tired," Amara replied with a slow, contented blink. When the door finally clicked shut behind Gisela, the silence that rushed back into the room was absolute. Amara stood in the center of the cottage, the folded quilt resting neatly on the cedar tray. The room smelled of honey cakes and the lingering ghost of lavender. She felt a profound, ambiguous exhaustion weighing down her limbs, a good tired that felt like a physical reward, as if her muscles had finally agreed to a truce with her mind. It was the kind of fatigue that didn't demand sleep so much as it demanded a surrender to the stillness. She moved through the cottage with the slow, deliberate grace of someone walking through water. She extinguished the lamps one by one, the clicks of the switches punctuating the silence. With each light that vanished, the room grew warmer, the shadows softening into a velvet embrace. She paused by the grandfather clock, listening to the rhythmic tick-tock that had become the heartbeat of the house. The silver key remained on the table, a small gleaming question mark in the dark, but Amara found she no longer felt the need to answer it tonight. The mystery could wait, the peace could not. Amara climbed the stairs to her bedroom, her footsteps muffled by the thick weave of the runners. Her body felt heavy, her mind a blank, soft slate. As she reached for the lamp on her bedside table, she paused. There, resting in the center of her white linen pillow, was a final, small scrap of fabric. It was a piece of deep, midnight blue velvet, embroidered with a single silver thread that formed the shape of a keyhole. Beside the scrap lay a small handwritten note. The paper was yellowed, the ink faded, but precise. Amara picked it up, her heart giving a small, unexpected flutter against her ribs. The note contained only one sentence, written in a hand that looked hauntingly familiar, yet belonged to someone who had not lived in Oakhaven for decades. "The key does not open a door, Amara, but a memory you spent 20 years trying to stitch shut."